of Relief, Analyzing Mental Health Trauma in Refugee Communities. This presentation was created by the International Human Rights Committee of the American Bar Association Civil Rights and Social Justice Section. My name is Clarissa Bejarano. I'm an immigration attorney at American Gateways, a nonprofit with offices in Austin, San Antonio, and Waco that serves immigrants in Central Texas. We work very closely with persons from around the world who have fled unspeakable persecution and violence, and our organization provides legal workshops that include extensive services for asylees held in 4 detention centers across Central Texas. As some of you know, working with asylees and refugees battling any capacity of trauma can be incredibly challenging. Many times, the trauma leads to self-harm, suicide, or the inability to advocate for themselves in a legal setting. Through this training, we'll discuss the scope of the trauma affecting asylees and refugees and examine possible remedies. So asylum law in the United States has its roots in the international human rights law. The starting point is Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. In large part, this article was a response to the aftermath of World War II, when the status of refugees was unclear and Allied governments found themselves lacking any sort of consistent legal framework for identifying and processing the enormous flow of stateless individuals attempting to cross their borders or who were already living within their territory. So this slide here, we're going to explain what a refugee is. So while the Universal Declaration of Human Rights formally recognized the right to seek asylum, the precise nature and limitations of that right only began to become clear following the completion of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the convention outlined a number of basic state obligations with respect to refugees, including non-discrimination, meaning that states could not selectively accept asylum seekers from specific countries, non-penalization, meaning that asylum seekers should not be penalized for asking for asylum, and non-refoulement, meaning that any asylum seeker cannot be returned to their home country if they will be persecuted there. Most importantly, the 1951 Convention establishes the formal definition of refugee employed by most countries, including the United States, during their asylum adjudications. So the statutory definition of a refugee that we use today is a bit lengthy and cumbersome. We actually just passed that slide. So it reads, any person who is outside any country of such person's nationality, or in the case of a person having no nationality, who is outside any country in which such person last habitually resided and who is unable or unwilling to return to, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Most of the legal heavy lifting involved in asylum claims just involves the question of whether a person even falls within this definition and can reasonably establish a claim under the 5 protected categories at the end of this definition. The silver lining is that substantial federal precedents currently exist to ensure these protections and are continuously evolving to extend the protections to other asylees. So the eligibility criteria for a person to be able to consider an asylee or refugee is, first, the applicant must be outside of her country of nationality, which is pretty straightforward. Secondly, the applicant must demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution. Third, they must show that they are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection by the government of their home country from this persecution. And fourth, the persecution must have occurred on account of one of the 5 protected characteristics. And finally, the applicant cannot be subject to any of the bars to asylum imposed by international or U.S. law. So next slide, please. So we've assembled an impressive panel of presenters today who have dedicated their careers to working with various populations of asylees and refugees around the world. After our presentation, we'll have time for audience questions and closing remarks. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box and we'll make sure to answer them. So with that, I'll hand it over to our very first presenter, Liz.
Hi, everyone. Great. All right, so I can get started with this first slide that just kind of summarizes some of the information that you just heard. Hopefully, it'll just kind of explain a little bit where the clients we work with are in the process. So the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project, where I work, we work mostly with families who came across the southern border of the United States to seek asylum in the United States, and most of them are from Central America. And so this graph here kind of shows different ways that someone who meets the definition of a refugee can receive status. One way is through the resettlement process. Another way is kind of through an affirmative process where someone is already in the country and then they decide to apply for asylum once they're already within the United States. And then the way that that most of our clients came into the country and decided to seek asylum was coming to the border and requesting asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border. Another way, and the last way that's on this list is sometimes when people are picked up in the U.S. And taken to detention, they can request asylum as a way, and express fear of returning to their country as a way to defend themselves against deportation. So those are some of the ways that people go through this process. So everyone kind of has different processes, and I think that can be helpful for understanding that someone might be a refugee but might not have already received status, for example. They might have to go through detention to receive that status, and they might also kind of be coming to the border to request that status, and so they're refugees kind of in all of those categories. So the next slide just has a little bit of information about the Central American refugee crisis. As most of you probably know, in the spring and summer of 2014, there was an increase in Central American refugees coming to the U.S.-Mexico border and seeking asylum. There were many unaccompanied children, families who came to seek asylum, and most of those asylum seekers were from the Northern Triangle of Central America, so that's Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And as you can see in some of these graphs, there's really high homicide rates in those countries, and also they have a graph here just showing the spike in 2014 of unaccompanied minors, but that was also true for families and others who were coming from Central America to seek asylum. And so most of the clients that we work with are part of that population, just to give you context for you know, the space that I'm speaking from. Okay. So the next slide is a little bit about that journey to get to the U.S. And then you know, this presentation is about trauma, and I think we have to think about trauma in the way that someone might deal with trauma at different stages of their process. So someone might have had a traumatic event in their home country that caused them to flee. Many of the Central American mothers and children that we talk to have experienced gender-based violence, including sexual abuse and rape, and also have had family members murdered, have faced death threats, and so they have pretty serious, very serious traumatic events in their home country. And then to make it to the U.S. or to make it anywhere to request asylum, they basically have to travel to get to the U.S. border, travel through Mexico, and that journey can be very treacherous. So there are a lot of things that can happen on the trip, a lot of violence that can happen, and people are very vulnerable on that trip when they're trying to make it to the border. And in addition, the U.S. government has worked with the Mexican government to kind of increase deportations and detentions at Mexico's southern border. So many families are facing detention, deportation, and the fear of detection kind of at the Mexican southern border, and are not getting an opportunity to request asylum there. or it's very difficult for them for various reasons. And so some people might face detention at the Mexican southern border as well, and so that can be another way that someone might be traumatized or feel a lot of stress and anxiety when just trying to make it through the southern border, Mexican southern border. Okay, and then the last step, before you get in and start your process in the U.S. is the Customs and Border Protection at the border. Families and children and adults who are trying to seek asylum in the U.S. either present themselves at a port of entry, or they cross the border and then kind of request asylum once they're detected right after they enter, basically. This is for people who are seeking asylum at the border. And if they don't say that they have a fear, then they can be deported. And so, and we've heard more and more reports of sometimes people being turned away, even though they are expressing a fear. So that's kind of a stressful and difficult time as well that someone encounters before they're even able to seek asylum. Okay, and so the conditions in Customs and Border Patrol detention. So usually people are detained for a few days in two different kinds of centers, or they can be. One is what many of the families that we work with call the ice box, which is just really cold rooms. And there's pictures of both of these kind of areas to the side here that were reported on a while ago, about a year ago. And then there's also the dog kennels, what families often call the dog kennels, that are metal cages. And so this can be a really terrible experience for many families, again, who are suffering from maybe trauma-related mental health issues, but also health issues from the journey to the U.S. and have very difficult experiences here. And people have reported about the conditions in those centers, but they're pretty terrible. Okay, so the next slide is about long-term detention. So again, my organization is Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project. ASAP works mostly with families who went through family detention. So the U.S. Basically treats families or defines families as mothers who enter with their children. So mothers who enter with their children are detained in one type of family detention center, or in a detention center. Those, many of you might be familiar, are in Dilley, Texas, and in Karnes, and the Karnes Detention Center in Texas. And there's also one other one in Berks County, Pennsylvania. So that's for people, mothers who enter with their children. For fathers who enter with their children, they likely are separated from their children, and adults who enter alone without children, adult women and adult men, are detained in other adult facilities. And most of those facilities are operated by for-profit prison corporations, and that includes Core Civic and Geo Group, the groups that also run criminal detention centers. And so there's a lot of things that happen in detention. As you can probably imagine, detention itself is a really difficult thing for someone who is experiencing maybe PTSD, maybe other trauma-related mental health issues, and just having, gone through this process of making it to the U.S., spending a long time in detention can be very difficult, and that's especially, that's true for everyone, and then also true, of course, for mothers with young children, mothers with children at all who are in detention with their children. The children in detention centers and the family detention centers are very young, 2, 3 years old, babies, and there's even been some reports of the detention of pregnant women in these facilities as well. And, it's a very difficult process. And you might have seen on the first slide that one of the things that people have to do when they go through these centers is go through an initial interview to say whether there's a reasonable possibility that they can win their case once they're released. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of tell your story when you're first in the country, and when you are kind of in detention, and there's a lot of, you have to retell some of the most traumatic events of your life very early on, and you don't have a lot of time to prepare for that, and you don't have a lot of access to resources in most cases. And so that's one time when someone is required to kind of talk about everything that happened to them, including these really traumatic events, despite being in kind of a condition that's likely to cause exacerbation of symptoms related to PTSD and other trauma-related mental illnesses. Okay, so this is a lot of tough information, but just want to give you a scope of what it can be like for an asylum seeker, so bear with me. So the next slide is about after release from detention. So in the family detention context, mothers and their children are often released to pursue their cases outside of detention. That's all over the country in immigration court. That's not always true for adults in adult detention. Especially, adult men are often forced to go through the merits of their case in detention. So depends on your process, basically. So it's a very complicated legal process. Everything is in English. There's lots of requirements, and most people have a really difficult time finding attorneys. There's also a lack of community and mental health resources. People might be going to a community for the very first time. They might know very few people in that community and might not be connected to the resources that are there. And then there also probably are not sufficient resources to legal resource and other kinds of resources for these folks. And then less than 3% of families win their cases without representation. So representation is key, and it's very difficult to find. And so people are often going to court hearings, going to ICE check-ins without any kind of legal representation or support, and that can also be a very difficult thing for people in this process. The next slide is just to give you an idea of the effect of ankle monitors. It's one aspect of what someone's going through on someone's kind of psychological well-being and mental health. So these are just some quotes that we gathered from some of the people that we work with about what it's been like to be on an ankle monitor. And you can read them there, but I'll just read the first one. It says, "For me, it was terrible, a nightmare that I still haven't been able to overcome. Even though they took it off, I still have that trauma. Every time they call me, I am very responsive because I feel panic that they will put it back on." And you'll see in the other two, people call it a psychological trauma and refer to it as your life converting into a nightmare. So the ankle monitor, too, is a source of a lot of re-traumatization for families, for mothers that we speak with, and for other asylum seekers. And then, so immigration court proceedings and trauma, just to give you an idea of what someone might go through in immigration court once they're preparing their case to fight their case and to seek asylum. In immigration court, it's an adversarial proceeding. There's an attorney from the government on one side and then an asylum seeker on the other side, with or without representation. And the asylum seeker is required to testify. They're required to tell their whole story. And credibility is very important for asylum seekers. So if there are small inconsistencies in what they said, for example, when they were in detention doing that first interview, and what they say when they're on the stand doing their testimony during trial, that could be the basis for a finding by the IJ that there was no credibility for that person, or that person didn't have credibility. And so, it can be very tough because people who are suffering from trauma have difficulty talking about traumatic events. They might have issues with memory. It might take a long time before they're able to talk about certain aspects of what happened. And so it's very common for people to be able to talk about their story more and more over time. But unfortunately, the asylum process requires people to talk about what happened at different stages, regardless of whether they've had the opportunity to talk to a lawyer, to a mental health professional, to a counselor. And so the process of asking people to speak about their trauma is a really difficult part of the asylum process. So, okay, the next slide. And then one last thing from this slide is just this quote that I like from an article that talks about this. It says, "If one set out by design to despise the system for provoking intrusive post-traumatic symptoms, one cannot do better than a court of law. And I think often as an advocate, you feel that there's a lot of forcing people to go through and speak about traumatic events over and over again. Okay, so the next slide is just a little bit about my organization and to give you context. ASAP aims to prevent wrongful deportations by connecting asylum seekers to community support and emergency legal aid. And so the next slide is a more positive slide than the other ones that I have been going through because it's about how psych evaluations can respond to this kind of process that individuals are forced to go through to get asylum. And this is about one of our clients, reason named Sandra here. She fled death threats against her and her young daughter. And then when she entered into the United States, she was detained. She received a deportation order during her process because she missed a court hearing, didn't receive notice, and missed a court hearing. And so ASAP stepped in, helped her reopen her case. And then as we were preparing for her asylum trial, she received a psychiatric evaluation and was diagnosed with PTSD. At trial, the psychiatrist who did her evaluation testified, and that testimony was crucial during the trial. So basically, the psychiatrist was explaining why someone might not talk about certain aspects of their claim because avoidance is one aspect of what someone with PTSD, how someone with PTSD might respond to traumatic events. And that description and the ability of the psychiatrist to explain PTSD in that way was really, really helpful. And the attorney for DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, stipulated to asylum after the psychiatrist's testimony. So with excellent, evaluations, with the assistance of psych experts, it can really make a huge difference. And I think that what we found in doing this in a few cases is that often people are diagnosed with PTSD. In this population that we work with, often people are diagnosed with PTSD, and having that evaluation can be essential to explain different aspects of their case. And so we kind of just now tell other advocates, assume that you need a psych eval, assume that a psych eval will help you understand different aspects of someone's case and one of your client's cases. And then my last slide is just a slide about resiliency. So just wanted to say that these families are incredibly resilient. They've traveled hundreds of miles to participate in the legal process of seeking asylum and have gotten themselves almost all the way there. It's just a lack of resources at a critical time that's making the difference between them winning and losing their cases. And so, with proper mental health treatment, with access to mental health resources, the families that we work with are able to really overcome a lot of the PTSD and other mental health issues that they might be facing because of trauma in their past. And so, just wanted to end on a positive note and say that with access to resources, that a lot of these issues that people are facing become a lot easier to deal with, even though it's still a very complicated and difficult system. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, sorry, I was muted. So our next presenter is Ariel Ricker, who is the Executive Director of Advocates Abroad, which is located overseas in Greece. Due to substantial ongoing internet disruptions, we'll be using her pre-recorded audio with her slideshow.
Executive Director of Advocates Abroad. Advocates Abroad is an NGO that's registered both in Greece, and it's a 501c2 that's incorporated in the state of Hawaii. It's comprised of about 200 attorneys, doctors, therapists, interpreters, and asylum experts. I'm personally based here on Lesbos, within Greece. Our field teams are elsewhere as well, in Turkey, and Italy, Switzerland, Lebanon. We also have a medical advocacy team that was formed in February of this year when a client of mine died of stage 4 stomach cancer. The purpose of our teams is to provide asylum assistance everywhere throughout Europe, anywhere on an unstable border where we are needed. We don't discriminate on the individuals that we assist on background or identity, and we provide our services completely free of charge. Our research and remote teams are based everywhere throughout the USA, the EU, South America, and the Middle East. We also have an externship program based in the USA. So far, since we've been set up, we have assisted over 12,000 individuals, both remotely and on the ground. We've assisted individuals from 38 different countries, and we continue to provide services in many different areas. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the situation in Greece, because that's where I'm based and that's what my specialty is now. There's over 65,000 refugees currently stranded in Greece. 14,000 of them are here on the islands. There are 5 hotspots. Hotspots are reception and identity centers. And this is where a refugee is identified as such and begins the process of actually registering for asylum. It's a long and excruciating process. And for many, this is where the process of mental trauma and distress is set in. 36,000 individuals are also based on the mainland. This process of registration is just as difficult, but there are more services available, and life tends to be a little bit easier, but not by much. There have been over 100,000 arrivals in this year alone. 300,000 arrived last year. So far this year, almost 3,000 have died or gone missing through sea arrivals alone. This, of course, is a large part of what begins that session of trauma. As I say, there are about 37,000 here on the islands at this point. They have arrived since this beginning of the year. That means we've had about 32,000 total asylum applications. Since this year alone, since January, we've had about 5,000 individuals who have been granted refugee or subsidiary protection, which is nowhere near enough. Oftentimes, this process takes about a year to a year and a half to conclude. Many choose to continue their journey by other means, through smugglers or through family reunification, so illegal means. But oftentimes, it's through smugglers or traffickers. Over 10,000 children have gone missing in the past year as a result of this forced continuation. 4,000 have been deported this year alone. Many of these are from what we call AVRR. That's an IOM program. It stands for Assisted Voluntary Return and Reintegration. Unfortunately, many of these individuals are forced to choose to leave, oftentimes when they're in detention or in jail. So it's a rather ironic title. Who are the individuals that are helping at this point? I chose to just focus on the medical, the legal, and the individuals who are doing the asylum interview. As you can see on the slides, these are the different NGOs that assist in medical services, from psychosocial services to medical emergency. There are legal actors as well, including, of course, ourselves, Ms. Hydroseat Group Council of Refugees, and the 2 groups that are focused on the asylum interview itself, the European Asylum Support Office, or EASO, and the Greek Asylum Service. The basis for establishing vulnerability, which is the legal status here in Greece, is showing that there's an individual condition that has been determined and that has been set in before the individual has arrived to Greek territory. That includes Greek waters. So an individual who survived a shipwreck in Turkey, for example, who has just been rescued, say, in Greek waters, that is an individual that is considered now vulnerable. It's a very, very dangerous situation because somebody could hypothetically cause a shipwreck on their boat, in which up to 100 people can die. But if they survive, then they will be granted asylum. This is written in law here in Greece, and of course, it's a very troubling aspect of vulnerability. This dog-eat-dog attitude is one thing that has caused a lot of friction within the camps. On these slides, you can see the different kinds of vulnerability that are also in the law. Pregnancy, or a woman who has just given birth in the past 3 months. Single parent, that means, of course, male or female with minor children. Unaccompanied minor, the elderly, those with a chronic or severe illness, such as PTSD, and those who are survivors of rape and trafficking, as well as, again, the shipwreck. Oftentimes, however, even though this is of course an important part of the process,
here. Continue. The next slide. The next one.
The conditions are not recognized when the individual first arrives in Greece. This is a problem both legally and medically, particularly for those who have chronic illnesses that require medication and consistent review. That's led to many NGOs setting up their own medical services for vulnerable individuals. That's again how Advocate set up its own medical advocacy team because of this lack of medical services that are readily available here in Greece. The reason why it is so important to establish vulnerability is because it permits the exemption of the refugee from something that is called the admissibility interview. This admissibility interview is, in fact, a degrading process by which individuals must prove that they are, in fact, weak and in vulnerable condition enough that they should not have to be asked the embarrassing questions of whether or not they even fulfill the standards required to show that they can apply for refugee status. That means that they are not asked if they are a refugee. They are asked whether or not they are permitted to apply for refugee status. This is not something that is new. It is written into the EU directives and is something that has been applied in other countries. However, here in such an emergency situation, clearly it is a problem and it is a huge holdup in terms of processing applications. As I noted earlier, I am based here on Lesbos and I've been here for the past year and a half. Prior to this, I was in Turkey, Croatia, Serbia, and other parts of Greece. I've seen this kind of suffering firsthand, and I see it also in the volunteers that are coming here to assist. Nobody is prepared for this crisis, and nobody knows really how to deal with it. There are not enough services, and there are not enough professionals. This is a problem that has not been resolved, and I do not think it ever will be resolved. From this slide here, Voices from Lesbos, these are a few quotes from my clients here. These individuals have suffered a great deal, both in their home country and here in Greece, not to mention the difficulties they went through when they were crossing over from that dangerous sea. As my client said, everyone is suffering from the same disease in Moria. Moria camp is one of the most infamous camps in all of Greece, in fact, all of Europe. Since Calais was dismantled, Moria has become the byword for a vicious European treatment of refugees. A number of refugees have died here in the past year. We have witnessed 2 burning alive from unstable gas canisters that exploded and 3 that froze to death earlier this year. It was a horrific thing to witness, and I would not want to wish this on anyone. But individuals who are stuck into a small camp are often forced to see things that they should not have to see, even when they have reached a place that they thought was a haven of safety. Many have lost hope at this point, and I believe that this is the most dangerous thing. When a person loses hope, they have nothing left to live for. As you may be seen in the media, there has been intense and continuous degradation of individuals who seek asylum. It is not a respected process, and the title refugee is one that is not respected. Nobody wants to be labeled as a refugee. However, oftentimes they must. So we wonder, why is it that so many are untreated in the EU in 2017? As I noted, there is a lack of qualified personnel who are here. I myself was a legislative attorney in Hawaii before I came out to do this work in refugee law. I never knew I was going to get into this work, but I had to, because nobody else was here to do it. There is an intense racism in this system as well, and there's no other way to look at it. There is a euphemism for a nationality that is preferred for certain kinds of treatment, and that really just means that those who are Syrian or Iraqi or sometimes from Afghanistan, depending on where, then those individuals are entitled to the benefit of the doubt that they're in fact refugees. This is a ridiculous and illegal proposition. There are also financial barriers in the transport between mainland and island here in Greece. This is a problem because many of the interviews that are done for determining refugee status are done on the mainland. If you cannot afford to get to the mainland, then your refugee interview is canceled and you are deported. There are many problems here that cause intense and ongoing distress and trauma. As you see on the next slide, a few causes of distress and trauma. I listed as many as came to mind in about 30 seconds. You can see there's a good deal here. There are mental health conditions arising during the journey. As noted, shipwrecks, smugglers. I've heard stories of children who had guns put to their heads in order to be forced onto boats. Many do not want to come to Greece, but are forced on. This is an economic advantage and benefit for many smugglers. and that is not something that is lost on the refugee. There are historical animosities that do arise in camp, but I would say, for the most part, many of the fights, all the tumult that you hear often in the news, these are things that are based on the stresses that arise in living in a place that does not want you and that will not provide for you or keep you safe. There's a prolonged asylum application as well. It's often difficult to try and capture all the horror that is witnessed here and all the horror that goes on in just 10 minutes. But I hope I've been able to lay out for you some of the problems that exist here and why. If you have any further questions, then this last slide here presents different ways in which you can contact us if you'd like to volunteer in Greece or any of the other places where we have field teams, or remotely where you are in the United States. Thank you for your attention and good luck out there.
Ready? For me? Can I start?
Yeah, sorry. Our next presenter is Dr. Dan Savin. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone very much for attending today. I'm very happy to see people who are interested in helping refugees and those seeking political asylum. As we heard from Ms. Willis and from the representative from Advocates Abroad, there are many refugees and asylum seekers currently who are experiencing extreme conditions and suffering from a lot of trauma. So in my brief talk, I'm going to talk first about adverse events and vulnerabilities that refugees and asylum seekers are likely to see. I won't have to talk a lot about that because I think we've just heard. And I'd like to briefly mention a couple strengths that refugees and asylum seekers often bring. And I'm going to talk about common psychiatric diagnoses that we see in clinical populations, and then I'll talk briefly about treatment. So, next slide. So, when I talk with refugees, and I'm going to mention that I mostly work with refugees who have already been approved for permanent resettlement in the United States, and the situation of these refugees is very different from the situation of the refugees and asylum seekers that we heard from the other two speakers. In those cases, refugees and asylum seekers do not yet have knowledge of a place where they can go for permanent resettlement, and that really is a huge stress and a huge difficulty for them. When I meet with refugees, I like to understand a little bit about 3 stages in their migration process. I like to learn something about pre-migration, their pre-migration lives, something about how they migrated, in this case to the United States. Oftentimes I'll use an atlas and ask them to tell me the trajectory of how they've gotten to where they are. And then I like to hear a little bit about post-migration. So as you've heard, some of the traumas that can occur during the migration process include war trauma. Some people have been kidnapped, tortured, loss of friends, family members, loss of livelihoods, loss of socioeconomic status, loss of daily routine, loss of things like hobbies and climate. Adjustment to a new climate is important. Refugees must adjust to new language and culture, and unfortunately, in some circumstances, they must face discrimination. In addition, refugees also have to often adjust their hopes and dreams. Oftentimes, refugees hold out these hopes and dreams that are finally going to come true when they finally get resettled, but a lot of times those dreams don't quite come true, and they need to displace these dreams onto the lives of their children. Next slide. So refugees and asylum seekers do come with important strengths. Oftentimes, they have a lot of resilience. They've overcome a lot of obstacles in the past. And oftentimes, despite their families and communities being torn apart, they still have residual family and community ties that promote an effective informal social support network in many refugees communities. Next slide. So this is a picture of two Cambodian monks, and I put this in to emphasize how religious, spiritual, and cultural practices can often be a source of strength for refugees. Next slide. So some common psychiatric diagnoses, the ones that you've heard of the most are probably post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, somatization disorders where people complain a lot about medical symptoms are also apparent. In addition, many refugees also suffer from traumatic brain injury. I think if you keep clicking the slide, that one will come up. So it's impossible to give an example that's going to encompass all the different problems, mental health problems refugees can come with. But I'm going to talk about one case in the next 2 minutes that I hope will give some idea of the interplay between health, mental health, social, and financial issues. So this is a case of an Iranian man in his early 40s who was referred by his resettlement agency for treatment due to anger problems. He was arguing constantly with his resettlement case manager and had been fired from multiple jobs. He was very concerned about his financial situation, especially how he would support his family of 5. This man had spent many years as a political prisoner. He had been tortured, and the experience left him with physical and emotional scars. When asked by his work supervisor to perform physical labor, which was the only type of work he could get because he didn't know enough English to get a desk job, he was in constant pain, and this pain constantly reminded him of torture that he had experienced. In addition to chronic pain and other psychological reminders of trauma, he had also been beaten on the head, which in addition to causing constant headaches may have decreased his impulse control and caused him to get upset with others, including family members, more quickly and easily. So this is just one case that illustrates the interplay between medical and mental health problems, and it also illustrates the fact it can illustrate the stigma a little bit. Most refugees initially that come in for mental health treatment if they don't have friends or family who've also gotten mental health treatment, they're reluctant. This patient came not to request help for a mental health system, but he came because his case managers and people who were working with him strongly urged him to come for help. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So back one. So this is an intervention pyramid, and by this pyramid, I hope to illustrate how, if you see on the bottom, in order to intervene in mental health, it's important to intervene in some of the social problems and it's important to intervene in the way of basic services and security. And so I think that's the point where we heard from, when we heard about the refugees coming to Greece, Syrian and Afghani refugees in particular. The main consideration for them is basic services and security. And by focusing on basic services and security, that's also going to help with their mental health. And if you try to refer them for mental health services when they don't have enough to eat, it's going to be hard for them to focus on specific mental health services. So when people have basic services and security, then it's important to strengthen community and encourage family support. And this can be done through, for example, encouraging kids to go to school, helping newly arrived refugees obtain employment. And by doing so, the mental health of these communities will also be aided. On the second to top of the pyramid, you see focused psychosocial support. So this can include recreational services or help for people who have been identified as having problems. For example, kids who are having problems in school, maybe there's an after-school program that can help them. Maybe they can get a tutor for school. And maybe for adults, there may be groups such as cooking groups. What I've seen groups that encourage people to grow food and vegetables, groups that help people learn how to interact with Americans. English language services can provide social support. And only at the top of the pyramid is really where the clinical mental health services come in. Next slide. So treatment for me, when people come to see me, I do a lot of social services and case management. I need to coordinate with refugee resettlement agencies or other social service providers. I often help clients to access primary care to treat their medical conditions. And then we do provide psychotherapy or counseling, as well as medication to treat mental health conditions. Next slide. So I'd say the most important task for the clinician, and I think this is the same for the most important task for a legal assistant. For example, someone who's trying to gather documentation for the patient's asylum case is really developing trust. And because without that trust, it's hard for people to accept assistance. How to develop trust? What I do, I try to show an interest in the patient's background. I stress confidentiality because people, especially in small communities, people do not want their private stories becoming public. I often, in the mental health setting, elicit clients' own beliefs or explanations for whatever problems they have. I don't try to tell them very quickly what I think is causing the problems, but rather hear from them first about their own beliefs and their family's beliefs. And then clinicians and I think attorneys also need to understand the importance of a safe environment, which is the last thing that I want to emphasize, is really the most important first step in improving the mental health of refugees and seekers of asylum is really establishment of a safe environment. And unfortunately, in the first two presenters, we can see the environments were not really safe in the detention centers for people coming from Central America and the United States, as well as the centers in Greece. I think for the refugees who do receive permanent resettlement, there still is a place for mental health services. They're still important, but I think their overall mental health is a lot better because they do have a safe place to live and food to eat and a roof over their heads. That is, next slide. So I just want to mention some of the benefits for service providers who work with refugees and asylum seekers. I think, and I've experienced these benefits. It's been a great benefit for me personally to learn a lot about people from all over the world and connect with people from different cultures. And it's gratifying to help underserved population, and oftentimes our clients are very grateful. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Now we're going to open it up for questions. If we can have all of the panelists show your webcams again, we have a few questions asked. So the first question is from Chris, and he says, are there particular consent decrees that you recommend reading or researching when challenging these conditions of detention?
So for the family detention context, there is an important case called Flores, and you can read on, I believe on AILA's website, they have on the, sorry, I can just try to tell you the best place to look it up, but it's the Flores litigation, Flores, and they have, basically that was a case saying that children shouldn't be detained, and it kind of gives a limit on the length of detention for children, and which is 20 days, and so and there's some other information about conditions in that case as well, and that case affects family detention as well, because in family detention, mothers are detained with their children. So that's one case that might be interesting if you're interested in detention conditions.
We have another question from Laura, and she says, what to do for people whose language is not represented by mental health experts?
Do you want me to answer that one? Well, we use trained interpreters in our clinic because most of our clients are from countries where we do not have providers who speak that language. But adding an interpreter can be complicated because that interpreter has to be very professional, trustworthy, and keep confidentiality. And the interpreter also has to establish trust with the client as well.
Great, great. And we just want to remind everyone on the right-hand side of your screen, if you have a question, please feel free to send them now, and we're happy to answer. And in the meantime, do any of the panelists have any further comments?
I actually have some general questions.
Sure, go ahead.
I have some questions just in the professional experience of our panelists. I was wondering if they have any recommendations to share regarding any recommendations that they can give legal practitioners who need for their clients to recount especially traumatic events in support of their legal cases. Like how to get them to open up and then be able to just kind of walk away from it.
So, do you want me to answer that one? I can answer that one.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think as I was mentioning before, establishing trust is very important. Mm-hmm. And to establish trust, you really need to be in a safe place. So it can be very hard, especially, you know, the client can feel sometimes if they're asked a lot of questions, they're like they're being interrogated. Sometimes they can flash back to situations where they were perhaps interrogated. So it can be very hard. One thing I think is very important on the part of the attorney is patience. Mm-hmm. You can't do it fast. If you're in a hurry, it will go slower. You know, because if you're trying to rush the person, it just and they feel that kind of stress. I think it makes it harder. Other ways I think that could help is if the client, if meeting multiple times with the client can help, I think, mm-hmm. to establish trust. If you don't have time to meet multiple times, then if the client has someone else that they trust that could join them in the session, that may be helpful. I've heard of mental health practitioners joining in sessions. I've had family members join in sessions, and I think sometimes that can help the client feel more safe, I think.
Liz, do you want to add anything? Sorry. I was just asking Liz, since you practice in immigration and work with asylees, just what your experience, what you think works best.
Yeah, of course. So I think a lot of the things that were already said, of course, are really helpful. And I think another thing that legal professionals and advocates can do is to be familiar with symptoms of PTSD and other trauma-related mental health things that people might be suffering from. So if you know, I think sometimes if you're not familiar with them, you might think that someone is not telling you for some unrelated reason. You might think that someone is not being forthcoming with you. I think sometimes advocates say that they're worried about inconsistencies even when they're talking to a client. And so I think it's really important for legal advocates to familiarize themselves with trauma, like with the effect of trauma on a person's ability to talk about what happened to them and the different ways that that can manifest, especially in initial interviews and initial conversations. And I think that can make a big difference when you're talking to someone. If you know to be patient and you know that it might take multiple sessions, and I think talking to psych professionals really helps with that.
Great. So we have another question, and this one is from Rebecca, and her question is, what is the best way to address issues with asylum and refugees? Is it through legislation or more private nonprofits?
I don't know if you want me to answer this one, or I think probably maybe everyone could, but I think all of the above. I think that there's a lot of issues in the system that would need to be addressed at a higher level. There's systematic issues that go beyond kind of working on individual cases that, you know, it would be great to have changes in legislation and less detention and less criminalization of asylum seekers. And that would take, you know, it would be great if we had better policies and things on those issues. But we also have to work in the system that exists and defend people who are having to go through it as it is now. So I think both is the answer. And hopefully working with people, you know, I think that direct representation, so working with people on a one-on-one basis, helps you understand what the issues are so that then you can go and advocate at a higher level and so that they feed into each other.
I'd like to add that so I work in a nonprofit, and we're at the family detention centers and other detention centers, and one thing that we're always short on is volunteers. So getting some volunteers who are trained and willing to provide consistent help in any capacity, even just language translation, is super helpful.
And so this next question is from Elisa, and she says, what is the best way for interested parties to get involved in advocating for and assisting refugees in the process of getting asylum status and also getting access to necessary services?
I can just echo Clarissa and say that I think volunteering is great. Volunteering at the family detention centers, volunteering at local organizations that provide assistance to refugees or to asylum seekers. So there's refugee resettlement organizations in many communities that, you know, need help, you know, with things that anyone can help with language classes and things like that. And that's also true for asylum seekers. There's organizations that help give people rights or give, you know, a lot of interpretation is needed at different stages. And so I think volunteering is a huge thing. There's just a huge need at all times. You can volunteer with us if you want to. We need a lot of interpretation and remote volunteers for things too, no matter where you live. So I think getting involved with organizations that are doing the work is a huge thing.
I agree.
I think on a larger scale, I think we need to look at what our leaders support, and if one wants to support resettlement of refugees, then he or she should look at who are we supporting? Where is your vote going to go?
Yeah.
Do those leaders support, you know, providing safe havens for refugees?
Samantha asks, do you have any suggestions for documents supporting country conditions? For example, the country reports or UNHCR guidelines, etc. Are there any good resources you can share?
So I think we all use the same ones, right? It's like the Department of State, UNHCR, there's Amnesty International, there's the CGRS, Center on Gender and Refugee Studies, out of UCLA, and they have amazing, very, very good, very detailed reports, expert opinions that we can use to supplement all of our filings. That's where we start.
Agreed. On many of those. There's also some like Insight Crime and El Faro in Central America have some reports on violence and stuff within those countries. If you're working with Central American refugees in particular, that can maybe help you orient yourself to different groups, criminal groups that are operating in the region and that kind of thing as a starting place.
Felipa asks, many of the interpreters where I am working have their own trauma that may be similar to those of asylum seekers. Do you have any recommendations for preventing re-traumatization of interpreters?
I can say, you know, I've definitely seen that problem come up, and I think it takes a certain stability, emotional stability to work with traumatized patients. And that it can kind of be a double-edged sword, because sometimes the interpreter is in a situation where they really need the financial resources, the job to do this, but then, they get traumatized in addition. So it can be hard for the provider has to make some determination at some point. Can this interpreter work in this area? Sometimes we've had to say no. What can we do to prevent the re-traumatization? I think talking to the interpreter privately, listening to their concerns, allowing them a space to talk and share how they might be triggered by a particular client's processes, and sometimes that can really help a lot, and the interpreter can go back in and process things well and do a good job interpreting with the patient. Sometimes, there are interpreters who are not able to really work well in the capacity as an interpreter, interpreting for people who are recounting traumatic stories.
Marie asks, how do you self-care and not burn out?
That's a really good question, and I think it's something that people in our field really struggle with, like when to step away, because there's this very heavy burden to help and help and help, because this need never ends. But at what point do you stop and take care of yourself, right? So when I first started in this field, I hardly ever took a vacation, and then work just became so difficult for me, even though I love it and I couldn't see myself doing anything else. But it isn't really something that people are trained to do, like to notice that you're burning out or that you're suffering from like secondhand trauma. So it's just doing things to be in tune with yourself, and taking that time to relax is super important. That's me as a lawyer. I'm very interested to see what somebody in the field could tell me what to do to chill out a little bit.
Well, I can say in my field, the thing that's helped me the most on a day-to-day basis, and also what I think has helped my colleagues the most, is talking with each other. I think that's been like the first stop. That's the, really having a support in the area or where one is working. I think that's been the best thing, I think, for me. And then outside of that, personally, I go back to my own hobbies, things that I like to do, outdoor activities, friends, family, spending time in those areas. There are also, if these things don't work, there are like courses on care for the caregiver, and they'll teach things like mindfulness and relaxation techniques and imagery, and those kind of things.
I'm not sure that I have it all figured out yet, but I think the things that have been helpful for me are having, first of all, like I said, about being aware of maybe the symptoms of trauma. I think also being aware of symptoms of burnout is helpful, like just knowing what might be signs that you're pushing it too far. I think sometimes we can go really far before recognizing that we might be pushing it, and so just reviewing what might be some of the signs of burnout is probably helpful. And then I think also just having supportive people in your life, like just letting people know in your life that you're trying to prioritize spending time with friends and family and exercising and things like that, and then having people hold you accountable to that and support you in that. And so I think that my coworkers help me do that, and we're trying to always support each other with that. And then also, you know, my loved ones in my life too. And I think that that's really helpful, just creating a network of people who are like, you're doing too much, you know, like you're pushing it too much, or you seem like you're having a hard time. I think that creating that network for yourself is really helpful, and talking to people about it.
Okay, I think we are ready to conclude this presentation. I think the discussion has been really helpful, and I really want to thank all of our panelists for all of your contributions, your insights, and your experiences. As somebody in the field, I feel like I learned a lot, and I hope that all of the people who attended did as well. We do apologize for technical difficulties, and we're going to circulate the slides to all our attendees. We're also going to send out a follow-up email tomorrow for your feedback. If you have any questions, you can send them to crsj@americanbar.org. So with that, I would like to conclude by thanking Ms. Shekinah Apedo. She's a 2L at Western Michigan University Cooley Law School with a concentration, and so she's studying law, and she put all of this together. So her concentration is in international law, and she was definitely very instrumental in bringing us together to discuss this very timely and pressing need. So thank you all for attending, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.